Dragon Ballers, if you're looking to buy Dragon Ball Super or One Piece sealed product, make sure to get 5% off using my link to Mystic TCG down in the description. You can also sell cards to them using their Facebook link, which is also down in the description. Yo, what's going on, Dragon Ballers? Welcome back to another video. I gotta tell you guys, I was pretty certain we were getting a ban list today, as I'm sure many of you guys also thought, but we didn't. And this seems to be like the deepest into reveal season that we haven't gotten a ban list yet. Normally we had the full contents of the ban list with like 3 weeks up until the actual set release, but we're about 1 week up until the release of set 20. And I know we had some weird timing with worlds and all, so that's probably why we haven't got it yet, but I was really certain it was going to be today, but maybe it'll be like early next week or something, who knows. But we didn't get a ban list, so today what we're going to do is we're going to go over the ban list, wish list, and predictions. So both what I would like to happen on the ban list as well as what I actually think is a bit more likely to happen on the ban list. I've rounded up the usual suspects to talk about the different hits that the community generally always throws around, but I also have one hit that I think is really justified that is probably going to throw you guys off, but once I explain it, hopefully it makes sense. But of course, if I miss anything or if you guys have any differing opinions, do drop them down in the comments. This is a discussion style video after all, meant to generate discussion, so drop those comments. Let me know what you guys are thinking. If you guys are new, make sure to subscribe, hit that bell so you never miss a video, and we're going to jump right in. But first and foremost, before I talk about my reasoning as to why I think certain things should be touched, I feel it's important to really blow your mind with this world-breaking graphic here as far as where the meta lies. So in my personal opinion, we are in a triangle meta. We have Crimson at the very top of the meta game. The meta revolves around Crimson. I don't think that's really too mind-blowing. Crimson has taken 50% or more of the top cut slots at the World's LCQ and World Championship, and this deck was a force as soon as it was discovered going back to National Season. The one short period of time where Crimson didn't really do all that well was actually in the European Zenkai Cups, but that actually makes a lot of sense because the Europeans came to Worlds with some really heavy Crimson counters. So that's starting to kind of piece itself together as to why Crimson didn't do so well in European Zenkai Cups. But as far as American Zenkai Cups are concerned and the World Championship weekend, Crimson was just an overbearing representation in top cut, taking up a really high percentage. So it is definitely the closest thing to tier 0 in this format, but that's not to say that it's unbeatable. It's just more so that tier in terms of representation. People are playing it so much and it's converting so much into top cut that it is kind of like in that tier 0.5 slot. But then we have Crimson, which just beats up on red black aggro. We have like the SS4 Gogeta, we have red Shenron, and black Spring Kai of Time, basically our 3 premier aggro decks, and Crimson should be heavily favored into these decks. Crimson has way too much combo power to be losing to aggro decks like this unless you have like a really bad start and you happen to go second. That's where these red black aggro decks can really kind of deal with Crimson, but besides that, generally Crimson should have a pretty favorable matchup into these decks. However, there are specific counters to Crimson like we saw in the World Championship. The super control version of Trunks Vegeta, we have Golden Frieza, you can even throw blue ramp decks like Beerus in the mix, and your odd green hand control deck. Those are all going to be solid counters to Crimson, which can win a good majority of the time, but those are going to struggle into the red and black aggro decks because those control decks need time to set up, and the aggro decks generally don't give the control decks time to set up. So that's kind of the triangle that I see here, and it's kind of a nice triangle because typically in a triangle format, there's like 3 decks and that's it. That's not really the case here. In this triangle, there's really more like 3 strategies, but a lot of decks within those strategies. Obviously, Crimson is just Crimson, but in the red-black aggro strategy, we have 3 different decks. In the Crimson counter control decks, there's at least 3 different decks, and probably more that haven't been discovered yet. Will we have time to find those counters? Depends on what the ban list looks like, to be honest, but maybe Crimson goes untouched and we have more time to discover those things. Who knows? But this is the triangle as I see it. If you guys have a different view of the format, let me know down in the comments. But let's move on to what should actually happen on the ban list. Of course, we have to start with the actual Crimson leader. Now, this leader has already been hit once directly and once indirectly. We had the errata, the leader that changed it to a dual requirement for awakening, both being at 4 or less life and having 5 sands in the drop. Now, I still stand by my statement that this errata alone was not enough to kill the leader, and it wasn't really that much of a hit in general, but what it did do was give Crimson this exploitable weakness where it could be stalled severely. You need to have specifically the 4 life, and if you're not able to self-awaken, if you're not able to get leader attacks through and your opponent's not attacking your leader, it is going to be very, very difficult to get awakened if you're not playing self-awakening in the main deck, which is not something we saw too much at the World Championship. So that is somewhat of a big deal, although again, Crimson can just easily overcome that by playing certain self-awakeners in the main, like Awakening Talent Pan or the other slew of 1-drop Saiyans that attack and take a life to get awakened. Besides that, though, there is a God Sealing, which was a much bigger hit to this deck overall, and honestly it's a really big hit to blue in general. We have seen the effects of that hit, but what's funny is it also just kind of buffed other blue decks that aren't Crimson. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But yeah, what are they going to do to the Crimson leader? What I think they should do, and what are they actually going to do? I don't think they're going to errata leader again. I think going with a second errata is rather messy. So what I think they're going to do is either just ban the leader outright, which we've seen be like a last resort for Bandai. They seem to not really enjoy banning leaders, which I don't really see the downside of, especially a leader that's just from a random main set. It's not like a starter deck leader where if you buy the starter deck, it's just invalid because the leader's dead. So I don't think there's really a problem with banning the leader. I personally like playing the leader. I think it's pretty fun, so I would hate to see it go, but I also wouldn't mind it just because of how generically powerful it is. So I really think they either ban the leader or leave it alone and hit things around it, which seems to be more of Bandai's MO. What I think is kind of interesting about Crimson is that there is sort of a balance lever in there, in that if you stop printing blue Saiyans, this deck doesn't really get any more support. And in set 20, blue is all about androids. So if we go like another set without blue Saiyans, maybe Crimson just kind of falls off naturally, and that could be a thing for sure. But generally, I think just like leave the leader alone, hit some things around it. I'm going to propose a pretty good hit actually in a second, at least in my opinion anyway. Alright, so the card that I am proposing to be banned is Ultra Instinct Goku's Kamehameha. The main thing about Crimson Goku is just the unreal amounts of combo power, which is obviously incredibly helpful defensively, but offensively it also gets a bit unfair. I've noticed this when I've been playing against Crimson, that once you get to a low life total, you have to just negate as many attacks as possible. Otherwise, you're just never winning the combo battle unless you are also just playing Crimson. In my opinion, UI Kamehameha is the main offender because of the raw amount of power it gives you. And on offense, it costs an energy, but that doesn't really matter for blue. The Crimson leader gets that back immediately alongside several other forms of untap, whether you use the leader's activate battle or Gohan Beast to restand your leader and get another energy back. So offensively, it's better than a super combo that draws a card. And defensively, getting that 15k and untapping makes it better than like Unbreakable or Beerus Destroys, because those cards offer draw, but this card offers the extra 5k that you probably got off that draw and doesn't actually tap you out. So yeah, I think this is probably the main offender in terms of combo power. It just offers way too much in a color that doesn't really get punished from paying energy in the combo step like all the other colors do. So I do think this is a pretty fair hit, and I am willing to bet that if you were to ban UI Kamehameha, that Crimson would be a lot more fair. That's just my opinion though, and I know it's a pretty hot take, so I do of course want your opinions down in the comments. But anyways, let's move on to another usual suspect. We have the Majin Buu Unison. So the last time around on the ban list prediction, I was pretty gung-ho about banning this card. It is very, very frustrating to deal with, and my main gripe with it is that generally it takes an entire turn, if not 2 turns, to get this thing off the board, which means the game is going nowhere fast and your opponent has a bunch of free time to set up. That has changed a lot in set 19 for a number of reasons. One reason for that is green, which can pretty much get this thing off the board in 1 turn whenever they want to, but green's not super popular in the meta, so that doesn't really matter too much. The main reason why this card is a lot weaker is because of Gohan Beast in blue decks, as well as other SCRs that just kill unisons, and namely that's like SSB Vegeta, and I guess you could tech Spring Kai of Time Unison if you're or SCR if you really wanted to, although I don't know many decks that would give up their main color SCR to do that. But there are a lot of answers to unisons in the SCR slot, which even though it's a one of in every deck, it still makes the card a lot weaker because, for one, Gohan Beast comes down before this card does, so that just makes the card ineffective in defending against your opponent's all-in turn. But even if Gohan Beast comes down a turn or 2 later and you play Majin Buu Assault of the Agent of Destruction, that takes your whole turn to play it, and then it gets wiped, and then you're kind of just like defenseless for the turn they play their SCR. So the card's a lot weaker for that reason for sure. A lot of people are leaning into 3-cost unisons as well. Baby unison's pretty popular in Crimson too, but there's also just the no unison build that's pretty popular as well. So maybe this card does not need to be hit at the current moment. If green ever does become super popular, then this card is just dead on arrival. So I guess for now it's fine that it doesn't get hit. I still think it walls out certain strategies, but this card alone is not gatekeeping the format from Rogue doing well. It's really just the power level of everything else. But even in saying that, I'm pretty happy with the number of decks that are playable in this current format. So yeah, I think this card can probably just be left alone for now. All right, now we have to talk about ramp, because with the God Sealing hit, ramp has just become stronger than ever. Before, it was like you had 2 options for ramp. One, you could just counterplay the card itself that's ramping, which was typically SS4 Vegeta, and the typical answer for that was God Sealing. Now, if you want to answer the ramp, you have to play some sort of low-cost counter and hit the Whis out of the Z deck, especially in the Beerus matchup. That's really the main ramp deck you're coming up against. And now, your only other answer besides that is just killing them before they pull off their ramp, which is a lot harder. It really depends on what type of deck you're playing and what type of ramp deck you're up against. There's generally 2 main builds of Beerus, one of which being a super floodgate heavy build, which has weaknesses like counterplays and Koitsukai and stuff like that. But then you have the basically Crimson builds of Beerus that just play a ton of combo power, and there's again where UI Kamehameha can be a pretty big offender. But regardless, once Rise of the Super Warrior hits the board, your opponent's just snowballing into way too much advantage because there's no counterplay to it. If you have not been able to be aggressive enough to really put them low in life before their first SS4 Vegeta, you're probably not winning that game. It's going to be pretty unlikely. So with that in mind, what do we do to these 2 cards? To be honest, I've seen a lot of people calling for both these cards to be banned, possibly SS4 Vegeta being limited to 1, and I think that's rather fair, but I think unfortunately if you do that, you leave the mono blue ramp decks just like dead in the water. I mean, Beerus has some other options. Like, you could force Beerus to go like purely into its archetype, where it has to play the 7-drop Great Priest and turn all of its gods on the board into energy. You could force the deck to go that route. I don't think that would be too unfair, but yeah, obviously you would have a big problem with like SS4 Vegeta ramp, where you could errata SS4 Vegeta to say your leader has to be a mono blue SS4 Vegeta. That could also work. I don't think that would be too bad either, because that deck's not doing too hot. So that might be a fair change. I think that would be the change that I would prefer, and the change that I honestly think they would probably will go with is errating SS4 Vegeta to using basically just being locked within his own archetype, and then turning the tide. I mean, they haven't banned it yet. There's been many formats where people have been calling for this card to be banned. Do I think they go with it? Probably not. Do I think they should ban it? Yeah, of course. I think people are tired of playing against this card, even though of course there are some answers, but with ramp being so prevalent, it's not even that hard to get to 12 energy and just like turning the tide plus Golden Avenger. So yeah, I think it's finally time for tide to go, but I doubt it. We'll see if they errata Rise of the Super Warrior though. All right, now we gotta briefly talk about red, because red didn't do anything in the World Championship or the World LCQ, but I have a small point I think is worth mentioning here. I don't think any red deck is going to surpass either of these 2 red decks until either 1, these 2 decks take another hit, or 2, they power creep these 2 decks. And both of those don't seem like great options, so I'm really not entirely sure where red should sit right now. I'm sure if Crimson comes down in power, then red is probably going to become a lot better, which might just be a good balance thing overall. And if Bandai can go ahead and print red decks that are on par with these 2, that would probably be the ideal situation. So I'm not really advocating for a hit to Gogeta or Sin at all. That's something I noticed. Like, in the new set, the U3 deck doesn't seem like it'll do anything in comparison to these 2 decks, even in their nerfed states. And the Invoker deck is not really an aggro deck, so it's not really fair to compare that to these 2 decks right here. So yeah, I want to keep an eye on these and see how they do after some hits to blue. But yeah, for now, that's what I was thinking. And then of course we have to talk about yellow, because yellow won the World Championship. Now, I think it's really important to look at this properly, because looking at yellow winning the World Championship is not the same as yellow just being the best color in the game, or even Trunks Vegeta being the best deck in the format. That was a very centralized tournament where these players basically decided, I'm going to play Crimson, or I'm going to play a counter to Crimson, and it just so happened the counter to Crimson won the World Championship. I am pretty confident that red or black would do very well against this specific build of Trunks, and that's perfectly fine, because again, this deck was built to be crimson, and it goes back to that triangle I was talking about. So with that in mind, I can't even really think of a fair hit to yellow under those circumstances. I just don't think anything is super warranted. We haven't seen yellow do all that well in the grand scheme of the meta. We've only really seen it just win the world championship, which again was a very centralized format revolving around very specific parameters. So I don't think any hits are justified for yellow at this time, nor do I think Bandai is going to go with it. But I mean, then again, it did win the world championship. That might be enough for them to pull the trigger on certain cards, but who knows? If you guys have any thoughts for what they'll hit in yellow, drop them down in the comments. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.